First, we would like for you to have to consider the content and the user experience of collaborative learning exercises, be they the dreaded group projects, which we'll talk about, or just a course as a place that you're hoping that your students work collaboratively. And so Felicia has some success stories, features of positive and negative user experiences with collaborative learning to share with you to kick that off. Then we're going to divide the component, the sort of pedagogy component, what you can do piece of this, into two different themes. So one is building a collaborative mindset into your course or program as a whole. In other words, do people in your class or the program that you run, whatever it might be, approach this enterprise with a mindset where they're working together, they're allies, they're colleagues, they're maybe not in competition, whatever that means to you. And the second is designing and assessing opportunities for collaboration specifically, and using your grading and assessments to reinforce collaborative learning, not just as a nice feature of our courses, and something that we're maybe a little more nervous about trying to achieve in this online environment, but actually as a specific and explicit learning objective. So why collaborative learning? So we all worry about the silent classroom. People who are collaborating together are generally communicating. I think some people worry still more about the silent Zoom boxes. We want to build community in our distance learning courses. Many of us, although we are valuing the public health reasons behind it, are potentially disappointed that we're not offering our students an in-person class. And some things just become harder. In my CLEG class, we always have Socktober in October, where students gather stocks to deliver to So Others Might Eat. How do we do that community activity remotely? I actually don't know yet, and I'm kicking it back to the students. We do want students to be professional, and working together can be a great exercise in accountability, communication, problem solving. Universal design for learning, which is really important to many of us. How do we make our classroom as accessible and our experience as worthwhile to every kind of learner? Some of our learners are doing better in smaller group conversations, in hands-on exercises, and alternatives to the big open group. It can deepen the understanding of material. You can have students work together for a deep dive. It cultivates respect for one another when they are relying upon one another and really seeing very closely how hard their classmates are working. And it can develop the trust that is a condition precedent for having tough conversations, which is, I think, particularly topical in an election year at our highly energized university. So it's hard though, and Felicia is going to talk a bit about that as well in her piece in just a moment. First of all, the K-12 process and college admissions process emphasize individual work, building a resume. I just did a pre-law information session where someone asked questions about building their resume for law school that sounded very much like building a resume for college. And it reminded me how much people have really been asked to just sparkle and shine very individually as opposed to pursue other goals besides sort of beating someone else out. If you follow current events, it's a tough time for people to work together. Technology arguably has made us less adept at conversations at times. With our students, particularly our first years, there are people who feel a sense of imposter syndrome and some who really have an expert complex. And I would argue that that can be even more challenging with a Zoom room full of first years who haven't yet experienced either the imposter syndrome relief of realizing the other students are just like them and know better, or the expert complex, sort of reality check of having people react poorly to acting like an expert all the time. Felicia will mention that students often dread group projects for various reasons that are grounded in reality. And of course, negative experiences with the socially distanced learning of this past year that students might be bringing in to this semester as their mindset. The two of us want you to take one thing away from today, regardless of what else you choose to use in your pedagogy or your learning. And it's that if you do plan to build collaborative learning into your course, be really explicit with students about it. Let them know that this is part of what you're trying to teach, from the beginning, from your syllabus language right through to your grading. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Felicia to elaborate on that point. And then Felicia, when you're ready for your slides on the next thing, just tell me to move it forward.
Of course. Yeah, building off that point, being explicit with the students about what the expectations of collaborative learning are, and also making it not a separate thing from the class material, I think is really important. I think those discussions from the collaboration should make their way into the big class discussions and vice versa, and really just have that bridge gapping the two to make it a more productive and enriching experience for the students and teachers as well. So you can go to the next slide. All right, so I'm gonna talk on some things from my experience as a student that have worked in group projects. And then the next slide, I'll get into some things that haven't worked and kind of my view on how to shift them into something that would work. So something that is really productive are group check-ins with the professor. I find when my professors offer expertise throughout, they often challenge my ideas and push me further to learn more. And I think kind of a misconception there is that the professor is holding the students' hands and spoon feeding them the work, but really I think it's an opportunity for them to act as a mentor and help us prepare for greater things outside of college. And as Professor Schwartz mentioned, with the universal design, flexibility on the final product, this allows for a creative space, and students each have different strengths. One thing I'll talk more on Government 352, my experiences in that class in a bit, but one thing for our final project, we had so many different options. We can create a syllabus, we could write a paper, do the traditional thing there, or you can make a video. However was most effective for us to communicate what we had learned and the solution we were presenting, that was okay. And I think that's so important not to put students at a disadvantage for what their strengths are, and whatever the best way for them to present the material, they're going to get more out of the experience rather than putting into a box of saying everyone must write a paper. And this allows for more transferable skills. In my experience in American Constitution, we did moot court, and this allowed me to improve on my critical thinking and my speaking skills. And in moot court, we kind of embodied the pre-professional colleague model, where we were put into law firms to work together. And it was kind of non-competitive in a way, because we weren't just keeping all of our knowledge to ourselves and trying to work for our own personal gain. We were sharing with our colleagues in the small law firm we were put into and telling them, oh, you should hit on this point, this will make your argument stronger, and things like that. Just seeing how you can help your colleagues to improve their work, and it'll come back to you and you can improve your own work. Being in college, we're worried about our GPA, and many of us are wanting to go to grad school after and go to law school and such. So we know that we need good GPAs to get there. But this kind of work allows us to just not focus on our own individual grades and rather helping our peers along the way, and it'll come back to you and you'll learn more for yourself as well. Another really positive experience that I've had is with SPA leadership. If you're familiar with the program, for first year students, you're put into groups of about 5 or 6, and you work in those small groups the entire year. And each group has a TA that's assigned to them. And I know that's probably not realistic for a regular classroom to have a TA for every 5 or so students, because this is a separately funded program. So a little bit of a different situation. But I think that something we can take away from that is how the TA is used in classrooms. My experience with TAs a lot has been that the TA is more of a resource for the professor. I've never personally been a TA, but I'm sure that it's a great experience to be mentored by your professor. But I think shifting a little bit that relationship in the classroom and having that TA be more a resource for the students and meet with them individually and utilize their office hours could kind of embody what we did a little bit in SPA leadership and create that relationship. So I want to go back to Government 352 for a moment and talk about what we did during the pandemic. So that was actually one of the most positive collaboration experiences I've had, which is surprising because it's the first time doing it from a distance. So we got split into small group discussions, and it wasn't even a project. We just met once a week, twice a week, with our small group, planned that schedule ourselves, whatever worked best for everybody. And we just discussed what was the readings on the syllabus. And for me, this was really important for my learning and what I was getting away from the class, especially during the distance learning. I definitely suffer, I guess, from imposter syndrome and feeling like I don't know enough to speak up in the classroom sometimes, and someone will say their point and I'll be like, wow, everyone else just sounds so smart right now, and I'll refrain from saying what I was going to say. So being in this small group allows students to get their point across, especially when they're more introverted. And it's really important to maintain community and connection when you're learning from a distance. So I would really urge professors to take some sort of small group discussion and implement it in their classroom, especially for first year students who've never met any of their peers and are expected to try and build a community and learn with them. And I want to touch on the colleague mindset as well. Using the word colleague when you're working with your peers. The first time I heard it was when we were doing new court, and it's kind of like created a shift in my mind, and it made me feel more respected and made me more inclined to treat my classmates with respect. I was no longer just a student arguing my point with them. It felt like we were actually working together and had a common goal to reach. And then on the line of pre-professional, I think that kind of gears things, projects and assignments to be more solution-based. That allows you to utilize your research skills versus just the typical research report. I think that makes it a little more realistic when you're aiming for those solutions and problem solving. Yeah, go to the next slide. All right, so now I'll touch on some things that were more negative experiences. I've had professors who have really honed in the every person for themselves mindset. This has fostered a negative competitive nature in the classroom and focuses on the individual grade rather than the learning process. While I do believe that in group work, each student should be graded individually and their circumstances should be taken into consideration, that's all fine and well, but when a professor hones in that point so much, it really makes students focused on their portion of the project rather than working together in the final product. I've actually normally the concern when students hear group work is that they're going to get left with all the work. But I've actually had experiences where the professors honed in on this point so much that some individuals took all the work and ran with it and then left the rest of us looking like we did nothing. So that's kind of an extreme on one end of the spectrum. But another kind of fear when students hear group work is incompatible schedules. A lot of professors are very adamant about, we will assign your partners, you're not going to get to pick your groups. But I think it's really important actually to allow students to choose their partners. You know, DC is the land of unpaid labor, so most of us who have internships also have to work another job on top of that, on top of our classes. So it's really hard for us to find times for 5 people to meet. So if we can choose who we work with, then everyone can get more out of the experience because we're able to choose people maybe who have more compatible schedules. I think that the school environment kind of differs from real life because when you're working with your colleagues, most likely you guys have more compatible schedules because you're all in the same workplace together. I see someone just put a question. And I actually think yes and no, that the incompatible schedule point will be alleviated by online learning because it's important to take different time zones into consideration. In last semester in Government 352, one of the individuals in our group was in another country. So when we all met, he was up at like 5 a.m. and it was the evening for us. So it was like trying to stay on America's schedule while we were all like in normal sleeping habits. So finding a way to make the time zones work when you incorporate collaborative work into your distant learning is important. Kind of touched on the lack of connection to class material already. Just kind of keeping it intertwining with the syllabus makes it more relevant and can allow you to create a better product with these group work assignments. When it feels like something completely separate, it's just hard to understand what the connection is to the class and the purpose. Some specific things that didn't work were papers. I understand that in academia and in the think tank world, collaborative papers are very common. But when you're in the school environment and worried about your grade, it leads to uneven work. And I think it kind of does a disservice to the students. Every single time I've had to write a paper with a group, the sections just get divided. So someone's doing the bulk of the research and then someone's just writing an introduction or someone's just writing the conclusion and having to just synthesize the research that their classmates put all the work into. So I haven't figured out how a paper can work well. I'm sure that in some classes it has worked well, but I haven't had an experience yet where it's been a truly collaborative experience in the writing. And then a firm end of semester deadline with no progress check-ins. Just kind of being assigned that project at the beginning of the semester and then the professor never checking back in. That's kind of something I mentioned in the previous slide of the progress check-ins with this professor. In SPA, we had relevant assignments throughout as a way to maintain that connection to the class material and to keep the group project relevant to what we were doing. So we would have the annotated bibliography, policy memo, then our research paper. Some professors don't like to do those tasks because they feel like they're busy work and don't want to grade you on those things. But I think it just kind of helps keep the progress going and keep feedback throughout rather than feedback once you're finished. And then the word group project, which is hard not to use. I've used it as I've been speaking, but I'll touch on that more in the next slide.
Okay, so thank you, Felicia. A couple of things that I want to just note, building off of what Felicia has said and then moving toward our other two learning objectives about the overall course mindset of collaboration and then specific assessments and assignments that involve collaboration are just the following. So first, I just want to re-emphasize something that I hope you caught that Felicia said about working in firms or collaborative groups with colleagues, actually deepening the work. One of the things that I noticed when I started moving people to more work with their law firms for moot court, which is a pretty hard assignment for undergraduates, is that the rigor, which is something that I think a lot of teachers think might be in tension with collaboration, the rigor actually increased. And the external validation that I've received from that from the attorneys and former students who judge moot court, that as we've moved to this collaborative model, the quality of work and legal analysis has increased a ton, is something that I've also noticed in my work. So I'd like people to get a moment not to think of these two as competing things, sort of the soft skills of collaboration versus the hard skills of academic rigor. The second is in this concept of when you decide how you're going to weight and grade collaborative work, paying very close attention to the extent to which you blend or incorporate individual and group grades. So I'll tell you as I go into this, the collaborative project in the course that Felicia was in last semester, there was a grade in toto for the work product, which was a presentation followed by a question and answer. And then there were individual grades for the person's collaboration, and I'll talk about that later in this. And then the question that, that Felicia addressed about timing, I have heard from students that many professors think that because they're online, their time is limitless. Because we're in a pandemic and you're not out, at a restaurant or socializing with friends, time is limitless. People are burned out. That being said, the online format helping students come up with their own ways of meeting with each other, saying it is a meeting. If you all are on an instant message app and that's how you're collaborating for 20 minutes on a Wednesday, that is meeting. So don't give them, don't be too sort of doctrinaire about what constitutes collaboration. Offer people lots and lots of information about the kinds of tools like using shared Google Docs, number of other things that will constitute collaboration, and draw upon what's worked for you. So building a collaborative mindset. So if you really want your students to be working together, whether it's because you value this as a learning skill or because you're hoping not for sort of a dead classroom feeling, be explicit about it up front. Lay the groundwork in your syllabus language. Say, I would like it if students thought of themselves as being part of a shared enterprise. I talk to students about thinking about their shared identity as learners, which also is a civil discourse element I feel strongly on, getting students more into a mindset of asking questions than debating. Really invest time in getting to know one another in introductions. I didn't really fully get until a few years into teaching at AU that there were students that actually didn't know one another's names toward the end of the semester, unless you made it a thing for people to know who each other are. Invest time in the community standards conversation at the beginning of the semester. Felicia talked about the transformative value of being referred to as a colleague. I refer to students as colleagues. Sometimes it's helpful as you're getting to know the faces, who are now very tiny little Zoom box faces, anyway, to point to someone and say, your colleague has just said the following, what do you think of that? So that can be good when you don't know yet that these two people's names are Keisha and Aiden, you and your colleague. But it also, I do think, sets a tone of that we are in a shared inquiry here. The dreaded idea of talking about a group project, I think students have had bad experiences with group projects. I now call them collaborative projects. Using small discussion groups to build community and distance learning courses. So Felicia mentioned that. What I did in my asynchronous course last semester was I did assign the small groups, but I said, meet with one another and determine when you can do your 2 half-hour meetings a week and how you're going to do it. So it's, going to be during class time on Zoom, or it's going to be, Wednesday night on Google Hangouts. Just do what it is, report back to me when that's going to be so I know it worked out. And they use those discussion groups. For the fall, one of the things that I'm changing to have a mindset of collaboration that endures, and I think this also gets to that timing thing and deadlines thing that Felicia mentioned, is that I'm actually putting students into their small groups and collaborative groups at the beginning of the semester, and they will stay there throughout the semester. So in the constitutional law course, the small law firms are going to exist, and I've actually found them attorney mentors. And those will be the default groups for small class discussions. When you turn and talk and do a hypothetical in a breakout room, it'll be the same group. So they'll get to know each other. And in that class, they each have a volunteer attorney mentor who's going to tell them cool things about the legal profession in addition. Leveraging your friends who would love to do something as fun as teaching right now can be a great idea in times like this, and really always. In my Intro to CLEG course, which ordinarily has had a group project that's assigned for, they're working together for like a 3-week period, I'm actually asking the students to sign up for their preferred topic in the first week, and they will start using their topic project group as their small discussion group for class discussions, basically starting the 2nd week. And as Felicia said, tying the small group work to the coursework overall, the new way I'm approaching that class is that instead of the group project being something that takes place for about a 3-week period in the 2nd, 3rd of the course, it now almost every class period I will include, how does the thing we learned today relate to what you're working on for your group project that you already know, so that both the collaboration has more time to happen in this befuddling time of schedules and challenges, and the relationship develops too, and the relationship between the collaboration and the course learning objectives is strengthened. And because this is AU and my syllabus has been up on Blackboard for a week, there are already like 3 students who have signed up for their project group, and it's mid-August. Use small group problem solving exercises, which I'll talk about. Use the Blackboard discussion forums, but utilize discussion prompts. I think peer critique and editing can be a great collaborative learning tool. If you do it though, I actually build it into my courses. Now I do give students a choice between peer critique or self-critique and editing if they prefer. I'm not sure every student likes to show a draft to someone else, but if people are actually interested, I'll actually give it with these slides to CTRL after this. I have a guide to peer and self-editing so that if students want to be their own critic but be able to show you that they did the process, there's a checklist involved. But peer critiquing and reflecting on that peer critique can be great collaborative learning. Student participation in evaluating coursework. So with the projects that I do, usually my collaborative projects involve a presentation component. And I don't actually think that students love to watch group project presentations, like 8 of them in a class. And what happens is if you want to do that, it burns up class time and there isn't any time for questions. So instead, I actually have students, I have a number of presentation slots that students can sign up for. They have to obviously sign up to be in their presentation and sign up to watch and ask questions in another. So out of 2 out of 6 or 8 in the class, and their feedback on the presentation is included in the grading. And they're asked to look at things like, how well did this group work together to respond to people's concerns? In addition, and when your peers, I think, are really looking at your work, it can reinforce respect. Offer collaborative options for all assessed projects. I actually, even for final papers, in some classes will tell students, if you would like your final assignment to be something you do in a pair or a group, and you have an idea for why doing it together rather than alone would make sense, let me know. And when students have taken me up on it, it's been great. So always offer, I think, the opportunity for students to be more collaborative if they volunteer to. It's been surprising to me how well that has gone. So big picture, we cannot grade what we don't teach. And also students, I mean, I tell my students, I'd rather you worked for a recommendation than for a grade. It's a better goal. But actually, when we define course engagement broadly and collaboratively, students can be working for both at once. So in my community standards conversation, I do let students know that at the end of the semester, their course engagement grades, what some people call a class participation grade, will include a little reflection, and it'll look like this one that you're seeing on the screen. And they'll be asked to, this is an old one, I now call it course engagement. But one thing that you can do if you want a community mindset and a collaborative mindset in your course is ask students to come up with examples of great collaborative learning, community learning, engagement with one another, and include it, whether it's in their personal goals that they set for themselves. I ask students to set a personal goal at the beginning of the semester that relates to course engagement and one that relates to academic attainment, and then they check back in later and self-evaluate. But you can offer them some ideas and have them contribute some of their own on what constitutes good engagement with the class. And I always include continuing conversations outside of class and helping another student understand. So in addition to fostering, I'm sorry, Felicia, let me pause here for your thoughts just on the mindset of collaboration. Anything you want to add before I get to the assessments and assignments?
Yeah, kind of just pointing in on the language change of group work to collaborative work. Students, I think, are kind of traumatized by the word group work. We've heard it for over 12 years and each have our own horror story associated with it. And the shift to collaborative work just kind of changes the approach and it's like how we work together. It's such a simple little change, but it really feels like a step up to college level work and collaboration compared to grade school group projects, and enforces that colleague mindset and pre-professional skills. It's a very small thing, but a huge change, I think.
Felicia, there is a question in the chat about the student perspective on whether to have stable groups across the semester or rotating them somewhat. What are your thoughts on that?
I've done both. My more positive experiences have been with stable groups, like we did once we switched to distant learning in your class, and to my experience with SP leadership. I think it allows you to develop a relationship with those students rather than having to get to know the group each time you start over. By the end of the semester, I think you're probably comfortable with each other and to challenge each other's ideas and, you know, ask questions and get uncomfortable in those discussions and really challenge each other and push it further. So for that purpose, I'd say I've always gotten more out of stable groups.
That is my recommendation too, but we were asked for the student perspective, and that's really important. And it means that someone took away the first learning objective really well already, so we're psyched. My thought though is I feel like implicit in that question is the challenge of like putting people into groups. There are questions of what if they're not getting along? What if something's wrong? Sort of freedom of association, things like that. So I want to reemphasize, like Felicia mentioned, you know, freedom to get into those groups in a way that works for the students can be really important. Now, there's lots of inroads into groups. I'm actually going to assign the law firms in American Constitution in the fall. I'm going to do it a little bit with some time zones involved. A couple of my attorney mentors are on the West Coast, and I want people to be able to communicate. With the project groups in my other classes, what I've always done is let the topic decide the group. So that's how it's going to work with Clegg. Now, in the class that Felicia was in, I actually just created, I think it was 6 discussion groups for Government 352. That said, we were halfway through the semester. I knew the course dynamics. I actually thought these would be quite good groups with a balance, and there were people who sat reasonably close to one another. So that's not the way it's going to be this fall. One thing that this group model requires, and I think this is particularly true for first-year courses, is that you really have a conversation with students about their responsibility and ability to communicate with you about things that are going off the rails. There's a group member that's not engaging and they're worried about that person. There are dynamics that are not going well. There's concerns about what does it mean to share this time and space. I've found fewer such challenges than I worried at the beginning. I think usually they go well. But if you're going to have people in groups, obviously, and they're going to be talking without you, then having a bunch of methods of making sure it's all going well, including just checking in. But I do think that stability can be really important. And it becomes actually quite great for the students who aren't as likely to communicate in the larger group. I had a lot of students in last semester's class say they talked more once they were online than in previous classes because of the small groups. Okay, so designing collaborative assessments and assignments. And I see someone ask, can I share what a successful rubric looks like? I have one in the slides, and I think it's a good rubric. Also, a pre-reading that I shared with CTRL is this project that I did with the University of California that's basically the sort of written version of this presentation, has some more stuff like that, but I can also share some stuff afterward. Okay, so designing assessments and assignments. So first of all, one thing that I find really facilitates collaborative learning is if you consider students to assume a role, a shared identity, or a shared mission or audience. So I like to give problem solving assignments, not just, you know, tell us about criminal justice reform, but you've been hired by the city of Houston to come up with 3 measures that can be done in the next year to reduce, you know, use of force by the police. And one thing that can be good is then it becomes also a reasonably good writing skills assignment to get people thinking about audience. So problem solving can be really great. And again, giving people a shared identity as problem solvers. In SPA courses, I both have people advise governments, but sometimes as well corporate entities or universities. In my experience, Fix AU projects are really well received by students. We obviously have to have the humility to hear that a thing that will shock us all, that our students don't all think AU is absolutely perfect. But students very much step up in a big way when they're talking about their shared interest in, for example, improving their own education or the community that they're in. And these can be great for any kinds of courses like complex problems courses or introductory courses where people are learning a bit about college. In the class that Felicia was in last semester, for the first time, I introduced what I call the dialogue across difference assignment. There, I wasn't asking students to agree to something and persuade us of it. I came up with several premises that had come up throughout the semester on which there was good faith disagreement in the class, such as should we lower the voting age, or should prisons be abolished entirely? This is a government class. And asked students to sign up to be in a group where you came in on one side of it or another, and study the nature of your disagreement. And I have a detailed description of this in the handout thing that I created. The nature of your disagreement, and assume the role of people advising a government that might be trying to make policy in the presence of either polarization or complete disagreement on this policy question. So examining the nature of your disagreement itself. What are your shared values? What is the nature of why you disagree? What priorities do you have that are different? For online courses, again, sometimes we do, okay, you know, paper 1 is due October 5th, paper 2 is due November 2nd, final papers due during the exam period. One thing is I offer students flexibility on fulfilling all assignments. So if you get one of my syllabi, they no longer say paper, they say assignment, and I'm allowing videos and multimedia things. I want to put this isn't a universal design presentation necessarily, but I do want to put out there that online learning is so incredibly text heavy that if you're thinking about allowing students to do different modalities, now is actually a reasonably good time because hybrid, flexible type things, you know, asynchronous classes, there's a lot of typing going on. So I just put that out there. Be thoughtful about how you incorporate individual and collaborative components. So I'll turn to my assessments, but giving people different sections of a paper can be really hard. So what I usually tell people is, you know, the bulk of your grade on this collaborative assignment, as opposed to the collaborative component of the class and your engagement in it, is going to be your whole group on, you know, prisons in the pandemic. Was that where you were, Felicia? Prisons.
We were public defenders and.
Oh, you were public defenders. Your whole group on financing public defense, you know, you're getting a similar grade, but there's a collaboration grade for individuals. It's how I do it. So assessing collaborative work. So I let students know in advance, much like their course engagement grade will be sort of a collaboratively sourced, crowdsourced conversation between me and each individual student, that their collaborative work, so their collaborative project, will be the result of what we see in the presentation, X%, and then how they assess their group. This one was for actually moot court, where there was, at the time that it had just one partner. So I asked questions like, how did you help? How did they help you? This is for doing a paired project. What was your process? Tell me about it. And then even some feedback. So there's a peer critique component in this way of doing things. Some feedback. How did your partner change? How would you assess them? And I tend to grade people on peer critique. Felicia noted that you could do a syllabus as a final project for my courses, which is a thing that I love, and it shows us what our students think of teaching and what would be a great class, by the way, so it's really fun. But I also give people opportunities. I really assess their feedback, because giving great feedback is its own skill. It's a great professional skill. It's good for people considering academia, and it's higher order thinking. So this slide is a group project assessment. So this is a Blackboard quiz. I haven't switched to Canvas yet. Blackboard assessments are really, really great. So when you do a group project in my class or a collaborative project now, the last thing is they'll turn in their slides to me, but each individual fills out a Blackboard quiz, and it has things, and I tell them in advance, right? This is that explicitness point that Felicia and I both made at the beginning. Let them know that part of this is you're going to be answering a question. Would these people want to work with me again? Would I want to work with them again? Every so often there's a disconnect between a self-perception and a group perception. I've never had anyone honestly bluff and say, oh, I was just magnificent, and it turns out, you know, she was off at the beach the whole time. There's the occasional student who feels like they had a very frustrating experience because they had to do everything, and it turns out their classmates felt like, no, you actually sort of pulled the reins away from me and didn't let me do what I need to do. So I now have a conversation about that. Like, how do you know whether your perception of this group and this group's perception of you of what's going on here is the real one. This is really about sharing. So I was asked for a rubric. So this is an example of a rubric for, I think this is similar to the class Felicia was in, where the final project was a presentation about a policy topic where the group presents for 10 minutes and answers questions for 20 minutes, which is my standard. And so the first three things on my particular rubric are the things that are really standard for me and my classes, what I measure. And then the last is this colleague rating. There's lots of ways to do it, but a great thing is Blackboard rubrics are wonderful. They're very transparent. And those of you who haven't learned Blackboard rubrics, like really work with CTRL to use these and let your students know. Sometimes they don't know until you tell them that each of these little things, like if, you know, each of these little things, you know, you can, I actually put the feedback on each rubric item in there for the group. And you have to let them know this is a thing because not all professors do it that way. But that way it really calculates things. And what I end up doing is I, you know, one thing that I will say about assessing these is that in order to grade a project with a component like this, you have to, you know, when Felicia's group goes, you have to tell them, hey, everybody finish your Blackboard thing because I can't grade anybody in this group until I've graded everybody. And you have to look at all 4 group members and see everything, see the collaboration. I also tend to, in this, now give room for students to reflect upon stuff that got left on the cutting room floor. You know, I would have done this other thing with public defenders, but ultimately our group went this other way. Now for fall, I actually, because the group project's gonna span the entire semester, I'm balancing where each student is going to have an individual portfolio that they're building in a Google Doc that includes their own personal reflection on the topic as it evolves for them. And then the group project that has its whole, you know, presentation that I'm seeing. And as well, because they'll be thinking about this one thing throughout the semester, I'm adding an individual contribution into the grade. So if you're in the group that's doing, you know, education something, there'll be an individual written submission that could be an op-ed or a speech or some talking points. Again, it's an SPA class. And I'm trying that for the first time. But those are not other people, that'll be a separately assessed item. Anything on this assessment piece, Felicia, before we go just to the questions?
Yeah, I think I really like what you're doing actually with the Google Doc of the individual portfolio. That could be really beneficial. But also just kind of grading separately the process and the final project. So, you know, there could be some really great work happening in the process, but maybe the product didn't pan out to all it was supposed to be, and just giving those two the separate consideration that they deserve and really looking at the students' work.
Thank you. All right, so this is my last Mean Girls GIF. I hope you appreciate the curation and thought that went into them. So our hope is to take questions. I'm gonna actually look at the chat questions, but I don't know if our CTRL hosts prefer for people to like unmute and ask out loud or just have us start pulling from the chat.
It's completely your preference, and I'm happy to relay any questions from the chat out loud. So,
okay. So someone just noted in the chat that there's a contract with guidelines and groups expectations. I think that's a great idea. And that's very, that's something that we do. I don't actually do a student contract for my classes. I know some people who do, but sort of a community standards discussion and community expectations discussion is something I do invest time in. And I think people who want to take it to that next level, especially if the group really wants to, that's a really thoughtful contribution. So,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
One question in the chat, forgive me if you address this, but do you assign one grade to everyone in the group, or can individuals within a single group earn individual grades? Let me see if I can go backward here. The answer is that in the rubric in the slides that I seem not to be able to, here we go. If you look at this rubric, items 1, 2, and 3 will typically overwhelmingly be a group grade, be like everybody got the same one. So I might even write, as I'm looking at all 5 students to grade them, I'll probably write on a Google Doc, like, okay, what was, you know, presentation and professionalism for the public defender group, and it's everyone. And then that colleague grade is an individual one. That is the way that I've typically done it. I do make adjustments for stuff happening that comes out in the colleague grade. And sometimes things that come out in the presentation. So for example, organization and presentation professionalism, if someone kind of dominated in the presentation in a way that got rough or ugly, I might take a moment to, you know, have that reflected in their individual organization grade. It's not super common. I've realized that it really merits talking to students in advance about what a good way to share space and time in a presentation is. But overwhelmingly, unless sort of a bad thing that has happened that hasn't really gotten addressed in due course early enough, what you'll have is that most people in the group, those first 3 things will be the same score for everybody, and that last thing will be individual. One thing I'm really pleased to say about wonderful AU students is that overwhelmingly that last score is really high because students actually do this really well. I hope that answers that question. So does the colleague grade come from their partner? So this quiz that they've taken, this is an example of a partner one, and this is an example of a group one. This quiz that they've taken includes their own reflection on their collaborative work and contributions, and their reflection on how that would have been received by the group, and their reflection on how that would have been, how they received, you know, and I read all of them. And so it's a combination. It also comes a little bit from what I see. We can see when we watch a group presentation that there's been an extraordinary collaboration, and I see it in their work product and their division of labor. So it's group sourced, and it comes a little bit from the fellow students who fill out, you know, who fill out evaluations, fill out, you know, their own reflections on the group. Their reflections on the group's work go into the substantive parts of the grades as well. But people can say, you know, I really appreciated the way they deferred to one another and who was an expert on each piece of their thing, and that will go into the colleague thing. But we can't grade what we don't teach, right? So we really do have a conversation in the both in the full class, and generally I like to have a check-in with each project group on how they're doing. Both of those are great times to talk about the sort of the dynamic and the collaboration. I hope that helps. Other questions? And we see the partner rubric again. This is, oops, sorry. This is from Moot Court, and this one is not only sort of an assessment of the partnership, but I also, with this particular thing, and I do that now that Moot Court, they have a law firm and not just a partner, I'm giving them, part of their grade on this project is their advice to their colleague about how they could do the oral argument better next time. Because for me, that's really great higher order thinking, being able to look at someone else's legal argument and say, you know, if you cited this case in response to Judge Thompson's question, it would be even stronger because this case is perfect for your argument. That's legal work. So that's not I mean, that's great collaboration and help with your, the idea behind that assignment. I say, you know, write something that will make the student hopefully better prepared for final mid-court than midterm mid-court. But as well, it's legal work. You know, you watched this oral argument and got something, and were able to use your own, you know, legal skills to comment on it. Sorry, I'm squinting at them. So signaling to a faculty member, last semester we were asynchronous with the small group discussions. So the way that I was in the room was with discussion prompts. You know, we can be there by saying, hey, here's what I think you should be drawing, you know, focusing on in your conversations. I don't think we have the capacity to sort of flutter into their groups and flutter out. And I think it would be a little bit Zoom fatiguing. So I'm hoping that the feedback on the small groups, I think a symbiosis with the Blackboard discussion boards, which was how we got small groups working with each other last semester and individuals engaging with the different ideas from the small groups through the discussion group on the learning management system, was also how I could see what happened in those groups. And I think that was good, but Felicia, do you have other thoughts on how that could be done?
Yes, so it's in the moment kind of intervention and assistance isn't really realistic with Zoom, like you're saying. But one thing we did in Government 352, a resource we had was to sign up for your office hours as a group. Every week there was numerous spots and our group could sign up to meet. If it was multiple people, we can meet via Zoom. If it was one person, you can just give Professor Schwartz a call, or Zoom if we still preferred that. But yeah, having that option to check in if your group feels like they need some assistance throughout the week. So just figuring out what feels comfortable for you to assist your group regularly without suffering from Zoom fatigue. Yeah, I'd agree with that number, 4 to 6.
And one thing that I had planned last semester to sort of stop into each small group and then didn't. I had other ways of engaging and people showed up on office hours and things like that. But one thing you could do is create a schedule. If you have a partly asynchronous class or have a class with small groups, you could get a schedule going and say, okay, you know, my class has 8 groups of 6 and I'm going to rotate and pop in and be a fly on the wall in some of the smaller group discussions at times. Will I be sharing the PowerPoint? Yeah, we will. The Google CTRL and I think a couple other items like this thing that I mentioned that that I produced. That's the sort of text version of all of this. Have I missed any of the questions?
There was one question. Do you have examples of contracts that student groups create? I don't know if you saw that one.
So I don't work with contracts in my classes, and partly I have thoughts about contracts. My lawyer self never departs, but my colleague actually that I worked on this course, this small learning course for teachers with the University of California this summer, actually did the section of our thing on community standards talks, and she does use contracts. So if the person who that was could email me after L. Schwartz american.edu. Oh, and I was supposed to tell people if you could just put your full name onto your Zoom for a second for the purpose. Sorry.
Laura, oh, hey, Laura, I just put it in the chat, but I can put other examples. I can send you other examples too.
Oh, great.
Of contracts that the students, it was pretty free form. We're biology, and so we're not like, we don't have a lawyer side to us, but it was just kind of, we didn't really grade them. It was just part of the participation grade. And it just allowed us to have something to go back to. Sorry, I'm feeding my baby waffles here while we talk. But it gave us something to go back to if there a problem arose. But more often the students were resolving their own issues because they had these guidelines and something to refer back to.
Very cool.
Thanks. Thank you for this presentation. This was awesome.
This is a cool baby. Oh, I almost said pie waffles, but first your sentence wrong.
That is all I see in the chat, unless anybody has any further questions.
See, A+ GIF game. I'm not a regular mom, I'm a cool mom. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I thought we would run out of time, but oh, I see there's one new comment actually. Everyone should be contributing equal amounts of time.
I think that's the example of the
got it.
contract.
Got it. Sorry.
If
And
you,
one thing about
I'm sorry, I kept accidentally responding to someone privately who I was talking to instead of sending it to the group. I'm still adapting here.
one thing about equal contributions. So I really like that the example of the contract was equal time to the project. One thing that I think is really important that Felicia brought up at the beginning of our presentation was that each individual in a group can contribute the thing that is their skill or the thing that they bring or the thing that they're passionate about. So equal contributions to a project doesn't mean that everybody presents 2 minutes, you know, out of 10, or everybody does X number of slides out of Y. It means being equal colleagues. And giving students an opportunity, particularly in this time that our education is a little flatter, it's a little constrained to this tiny box, to draw upon, you know, there's a student in your class, in your group who really is a hardcore researcher, and there's a student in your group who makes great websites and messaging or whatever it is their thing is. You know, a sense of really fair and equal contribution, but a sense of contributing from the person you are and and from the things in the class that motivate you and from the things about your education that motivate you. If there's room for people to talk about what does my contribution to this mean in terms of what I really bring of value, as opposed to everybody talks 2 minutes or everybody does 3 slides. That in itself can be just a great conversation for a group to have. You know, what is it I bring to this? And a great reflection for someone to have themselves, especially when we think about imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I think it's important for the professor to be aware of that, but also for it to be brought to the students' attention and kind of remind them that our strengths and contributions are different, because I personally have had to check in with myself sometimes, and when I feel like this group member is not pulling their weight, but then I've had to reflect on what they're doing and see that they're still contributing and their work has helped this group move along, even if I think what they've done was an easy task. Maybe it's a challenge for them. Maybe they really put a lot into it and they just made it look so easy because they're good at that. So just reminding the students to reflect on our strengths and what the contributions are, and that it all looks different for everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.